I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Linda Fan serves as the Public Policy Director for the Texas Council on Family Violence, where she directs TCFV's public policy agenda during the legislative session and oversees statewide initiatives to ensure the safety and well-being of survivors. Before joining TCFV, Ms. Fan was the Executive Director of Asian Family Support Services of Boston, an organization specifically addressing the cultural and language needs of Asian and other immigrant families affected by family and sexual violence. So thank y'all again. Linda, it's all yours.
My PowerPoint up for some reason on my side. I'm not able to see the.
Yes, we are pulling it up right now.
Thank you. Well, as we're doing that, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for your flexibility. I know that this was previously scheduled for yesterday, and the reason why we had to reschedule it, and this is just part of the legislative advocacy world, there was a impromptu hearing that was set up for the prevention of mass violence, where the Texas Council on Family Violence, what we do is we provide testimony on gun violence and especially how it's tied to domestic violence. So thank you for your flexibility. I had to be at a different venue yesterday, and I'm glad that we have so many folks who are joining us today. And of course, I'd like to extend my gratitude to both Brooke and Megan for providing this wonderful opportunity to talk about the work we do, and then also talk about legislative advocacy, which is definitely a great passion of mine. So my name's Linda Fan. As Brooke has mentioned, I'm with Texas Council on Family Violence. I primarily work to oversee our initiatives when we're trying to create policy, promote policy, and also educate our communities on how to be involved with creating systematic changes so that we're advocating on behalf of survivors. And we're using a quick little fix here because of a technical issue. I'm going to ask for the slide to be moved. So every time there's a new slide, you'll just hear a verbal cue from me. Okay, next slide, please. So I always like to start off with a wonderful quote from Margaret Mead. Never doubt a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, and indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. When we're thinking about legislative advocacy or policy, there's always a sense of feeling overwhelmed, like systems are too big, or the process is very complicated, or perhaps you have to build wide coalitions to make any change. But just like everything else, it really just takes a very dedicated individual or a small group of folks to really build the momentum in changing laws and policies not in our communities, but also in our state and in our country as well. So when we're talking about legislative advocacy, always remember that there are things that we can do on an individual level to make positive change. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to cover a few items. We're going to talk about what is legislative advocacy. We'll talk a little bit about what's the difference between an advocate and a lobbyist. I know that in the nonprofit world, there's a little bit of confusion around, how do we educate a legislator, but not exactly move to a place where we are an official lobbyist, which then puts us in a different sphere of needing to report, and then it also can impact nonprofit governance and in our grant funding. So we'll spend a little time there. Then I'll talk a little bit about the legislative process in Texas. I am aware that we've got a few participants actually that's outside of the state. And so some of the things that I'll talk about will be very specific to Texas, but with most state legislation, usually it follows a very similar process. So I think this will still be relevant to you. We'll provide an overview of ways to advocate, what you can do when you're trying to push a particular issue or a solution. And then I'll also provide an overview of our legislative agenda that we had prioritized in the last session, which ended as of the end. It was a session that started in January and ended in late May. So those are pretty much the topics we'll cover today. Next slide, please. So we'll start off with the basics. Advocacy. What is advocacy overall? And I think there's there's multiple meanings to this. We in the domestic violence world, when we think about an advocate, we're usually thinking about how do we help individuals navigate a system or a process, and how do we make that system or process better for the survivor, right? So that is a version of advocacy. There's also another level of advocacy, which means we're going to change the system on a broader scale. And so usually you see that type of advocacy when we're doing legislative work or you're trying to change like an administrative rule. And so advocacy basically is a catch-all word for the set of strategies that you utilize to pretty much create a change or a shift in public opinion. And you're also looking at mobilizing all of your available resources and your support in the community so that you can make sure that you're able to create or change a policy that will benefit others. Next slide, please. So earlier you heard me talk about, in the family violence or domestic violence world, you'll see individual advocacy that occurs a lot. So this is, as I mentioned, these are moments where you're requesting systems to allow for better access or quality of services for individuals. So I'm sure a lot of you have had some experience in trying to provide legal advocacy, helping a survivor navigate a court system. For those of you who work in the housing arena, you've probably worked with housing authorities to make sure, let's say, move a survivor up the list so that they can be able to access safe housing. And so individual advocacy is a big part of our world. It's what we do day in and day out. Then we have another level, again, as I mentioned, systems advocacy. This is where we're enhancing community and policy initiatives. And we're doing it in a manner where we may be joining a task force to talk about how do we respond to domestic violence survivors, or we create some sort of work group where we are looking at how do we address, let's say, children who witness violence. And so those are like the tweaks that we're trying to change on local systems. And then the third type of advocacy, which is what I'm going to spend the remaining part of this presentation, is legislative advocacy. So this type of advocacy is creating new laws to help survivors on a broader scale. And so there is a reliance on the legislative process, whether it is on the slide, it says state or federal. I actually consider any kind of advocacy you do on perhaps a city or a county level definitely counts as legislative advocacy, because you're working with elected officials who have influence, who can produce a new ordinance or a law. So that's going to be the bulk of this presentation, is how do we start off changing the environment for the better utilizing legislative advocacy. Next slide, please. So I think that sometimes there's a little bit of confusion and then also I think a little bit of intimidation as well when we're talking about legislative advocacy, that it could be confused with politics. And when we're embarking down the road of trying to create policies and change, it really is just that. We are looking at how do we create policy that makes sense for our communities, it makes sense for survivors, that there's no unintended consequences. Additionally, how does a particular law or policy impact service providers, programs, practitioners, you name it. And so it's a very prescriptive way of affecting change, which is very different from politics. Politics is, we're in 2019 and politics is, we're in an interesting environment. We're definitely an interesting environment. With politics, of course, politics play a big role when it comes to final legislation. And in politics, there are themes of, let's say, political stances that override policy recommendations sometimes. And we also know politics plays into elections, or actually vice versa, elections plays into politics. So one, I consider when I think about politics, I think about culture, and which makes it very different from legislative advocacy, where I think of that as more as how do you build new systems. So that's pretty much in a nutshell what legislative advocacy is and how it's different from politics. So I always tell folks, when I'm down at the Capitol and trying to push a particular law, I tell folks, this is my role and this is my goal. And at the same time, it can be political. It can be extremely political depending on who you're talking to and what you're pushing. One of our big bills this year, we were talking about firearms surrender protocols. To me, I don't see a political issue there. I'm just looking at systems. However, at the same time, as the quote says on the slide, you may hate politics, but you can't ignore the consequences of politics. So as we're doing legislative advocacy, even though it's very different from politics, politics do have influence over the process. Next slide, please. So earlier I talked a little bit about types of advocacy, individual advocacy compared to systems and legislative. Now, with legislative advocacy, there are different levels. Earlier, as I had mentioned, advocating on a city and a county level is pretty much the same structure or mechanism in doing that as if you're advocating on a state or a federal level or even on an international level. So going back on a local level, you will be working to create ordinances and agencies or policies coming out of specific agencies. On a state level, that's where you're looking at laws, right? You're looking at broader laws. So for instance, a law that we had passed this year was Senate Bill 971, which is requiring all law enforcement to get strangulation training. And then we also spent a significant amount of time in ensuring that we have the appropriate funds and resources to help shelters across the state. So that's an example of state legislative advocacy. And then on the federal level, which we hear about the Violence Against Women's Act and Fix NICS, and then also the Family Violence Prevention Services Act. So all of those bills are tied to, of course, federal funding, and it's tied to Congress. And then you've got examples of advocacy on the international level. So if you're working with the UN, European Council, or the Asian nations, on a broader global level, there are multiple decrees that talks about the elimination of forms of discrimination against women, and also there is the International Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women as well. So it's when it comes to legislative advocacy, it can happen on multiple levels. And I go back to my original point. They look big, especially when you're looking at the international level, but it all starts with an individual or a small group. So don't let those big changes overwhelm your role or your perception of your role and how you can contribute to this. If you can go to the next slide. So I already spoke about this, but you've got state and federal. This is where Texas Council on Family Violence, we spend most of our time when we're doing policy change work. We don't spend too much time on the local level other than providing technical assistance and trying to help divert resources to local communities, because it's your community. You know what's best for you. So, and there's also 254 counties. We just don't have enough staff members who address 254 counties and 254 ways of responding to survivor needs. So our role when it comes to policies for survivors is we work on the state and federal level. And on a state level, again, you know, these are areas of trying to pass state laws that protect survivors. We also do a lot of lobbying with legislators on ensuring when they're coming up with a budget that they do not forget family violence programs across the state. So we do a lot of education and lobbying with state legislators there. On a federal level, we work on providing our input with the Violence Against Women's Act. You know, we have great partnerships across the state where programs are telling us what is going on in their community. So we take that information, we distill it, and then we move it on to our national partners, and our national partners being we partner with the National Network to End Domestic Violence. There's also a national task force on domestic violence and sexual assault. There's also another group like Casa de Esperanza, which has an advocacy component there. We also work with the Asian Pacific Islander Gender-Based Violence Group too, and then coalitions across the United States. And we bring forth what are some of Texas's needs. And also when there are negotiations with VAWA, we want to make sure that whatever policy that impacts the entire nation, that there isn't anything that's adverse to Texas. And, a lot of times when we're talking about advocacy, and pushing policies, we're always thinking about unintended consequences. So when you're trying to prescribe something to a broader community like the entire United States of America, you gotta make sure that there's no unintended consequences to different states or different parts of the US. So that's just an explanation on what we do on the state and federal level. Next slide, please. All right, so I've given you pretty much an overview on advocacy, what it is, what are the different types, and what are the different levels. And this is where I'm going to sell you on an idea. We should all be advocates. You do not have to be a public policy analyst or a policy director to do this work. I came from the program and services world. I did not study. I'm not a lawyer. I play one on TV sometimes, but I'm not a lawyer. And I did not study public policy. That was never in my life plan. That was just never part of it. I was brought to this work because I worked in a community where I saw multiple barriers for survivors. One, I worked at Asian Family Support Services of Boston, as Brooke had mentioned, and I kept on seeing barriers when it came to resources to underserved communities. And I also saw barriers on, when it comes to general issues that impacted survivors when it came to housing and legal advocacy, legal services. I saw barriers where, law enforcement were, sometimes you had helpful law enforcement and sometimes not so much. And I also saw barriers when it came to allied systems too. And sometimes we got to call ourselves out, right? So there's barriers within our own programs in our own community that we need to address. And so, in my time in the direct and client services world, I started spending more and more time trying to change systems to reduce those barriers. I did it so much that it eventually became probably 60-70% of my job. So why I share that story is that, you don't have to be a policy person to do this work. And really the most effective people who can make drastic changes are the folks on the ground. And that's why we should be advocates. We should be advocates. That's where the influence comes into play. You're able to talk about the issues directly. You have the details, the evidence, but more importantly, the passion, right? You have the passion to do this work. That's why we do this work in the first place. So when it comes to whatever our role is within the movement, we should all be advocates. Next slide, please. And there's some philosophical stuff too. It's an open system of government. And I think I'm missing some words off of this slide. Oh, there we go. Thank you. It's an open system of government. It really is the way that government is set up. It is designed to receive our input. That's why you have comment periods when new federal regulations are released. Additionally, that's why you have hearings where people can come and share their perspective. And so it's the government is built that way for us to be involved. Additionally, legislators don't know all of the information. And more importantly, sometimes they don't seek it. So when we're down advocating on your behalf at the Capitol, it is a lot of times I sit down with a legislator and I'm presenting an idea. It's all new news to them, right? And there hasn't been a proactive stance in getting that information. And so it becomes our responsibility to educate legislators on the challenges and barriers that we see in our work. And then the third reason why we should do this is, as I mentioned before, you're the one who have the knowledge, the expertise, and the experience to really explain how certain policy and laws should be created, or equally as important, how they shouldn't be passed. Because there's a lot of sometimes good intentions with bad consequences. And so we need advocates to speak to those situations. Next slide, please. And I think, again, you understand the issues. And the reason why we do this, it's on the behalf of survivors. We do a lot of this work, we come to this work because there is a greater goal, and that is to really bring the stories of the survivors we work with, bring the issues that they deal with day in and day out, and move those stories to legislators, because it is a heavy, heavy burden for survivors to be able to not only keep themselves safe day in and day out in their homes, but then to ask a survivor to go and change a system. That's a heavy burden, and it's a big ask. And so therefore it becomes I always feel honored when there are opportunities to do that. And then the very last piece, again, when we're talking about respect and credibility, because of our experiences, because we know what the challenges and the barriers are. And honestly, you know, every time I go to these hearings, legislators want to hear from the folks who are working in their communities. And they do have a lot of respect for us. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. However, I will say most of the time, there is, because they can't get, they don't have all the information, they have to rely on us. And so with that, we have credibility in our professions to be an advocate. So hopefully through all of that, I have convinced you to be a legislative advocate. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So this is a big question. So if you haven't been convinced of being an individual advocate and you're kind of wondering, oh, I'm still on the fence about it, let me just dive a little bit into the role of a nonprofit. So a lot of questions arise: can I advocate if I'm a nonprofit? Yes, you most definitely can. It's entirely legal. It is also, I think it's extremely beneficial for organizations to advocate and lobby too. And that comes into a little tricky area. So I'll explain that piece a little bit later. But again, you're the professionals, you're the ones who have all the stories, and it's actually much more powerful for organizations to advocate on issues than it is for individuals. It takes individual effort and power, but being from an organization. So if I were to come to the Capitol and say, hi, I'm Linda, I would like to advocate on behalf of survivors, they're going to look at me like, well, what's your, who are you connected to? Who's your tribe? How does this really work? Are you part of a larger group? It's a lot more credibility if I were to say, I'm Linda, I'm part of Texas Council on Family Violence, and these are the issues that we see across the state, right? So it just, there's a little bit more power to being an organization doing this kind of advocacy. However, there are a lot of questions around that. As a 501c3, can you do it? Yes, you most definitely can do it. There are some considerations. If you don't mind moving to the next slide, let's see here. Well, I'm going to go back one more. Thank you very much. Nonprofits, again, it's one of those, again, I go back to my original point. Nonprofits know which laws affect their community. Outside of businesses, which have a little bit more of a focus on money and on I'll just say capitalism in general, most of the time nonprofits fall within the social services sector, which basically means that you know, within the nonprofit sector, we're working on behalf of the community to make it better. So there is not an ulterior motive of funding our business. Yes, there is the motive of trying to get funding for services, but at the end of the day, it does not tie to our wallets, or and it's what it is. We're a nonprofit. There's no individual that is actually gaining any kind of wealth or affluence from this work. So so we definitely need nonprofits to be part of the legislative advocacy world. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then I've already spoken about credibility, so I don't have to go there. Objectives. Now let's talk about being an advocate versus a lobbyist. Next slide. Thank you. So there's multiple roles you can play. Being somebody from a nonprofit trying to push for change. One, you can educate. I'm sure many of you have gone and have done presentations on the impact of family violence in a community, or did a presentation about trauma-informed care, presentations on the importance of prevention, right? And so there is opportunities of doing that with legislators, with individuals who have influence. So when you stick to those topic matters and you do not ask for anything, then you're educating folks. So you're not making some sort of, you know, broad value judgments, or you're seeking legislative action. So you'll see this if you're giving out, you know, perhaps a program description, or you're talking about budgets and all that good stuff. Then there's another level called actual advocating, which generally you are saying, you're stating a value. You're just stating a value. You're probably, and I use example in here, you know, clean air is good and we should protect the environment. You know, so there's a value, there's a goal that you're trying to achieve here. You haven't made an ask of this particular legislator. It's just going in and saying, you know what, we want communities to be safer. Our goal is to make sure that survivors have access to resources. So think about advocating as more as stating a value or a goal. And then you go into this other level of legislative advocacy, which is lobbying. Now, this one, you're asking for something specific. So you're asking for Congress to take action on an item, or you're asking Congress to give you more money, right? And so this is a direct ask of your elected officials. And once you go into this realm, then things get, you have to be a little bit more careful when you do that, because there are a lot of federal laws that regulate and govern nonprofits when it comes to lobbying. So if you're a nonprofit and you're sticking within the educating and advocating realm, then you have nothing to worry about. When you become a little bit, when you need to become a little bit more careful is when you start getting into the lobbying world. And so I always like to give some other examples. Next slide, please. Okay, so, you know, as I mentioned, providing reports and fact sheets, that's considered advocacy or educating. Tell coalition members that a bill exists. So to me, that is just education and advocacy. You can stick within that realm, and it's more like advocacy. Just stating that, let's say, I'll talk about Senate Bill 234, which is the expansion of lease termination. This is a bill that we got passed this past session, And what it does is that it helps survivors break their leases without incurring additional fines and fees. There's already an existing law on the books that if you had a court order, an ex parte protection, or ex parte, and a court injunction, or a PO, you can break your leases. So this session, what we've done is we've expanded that because we understand that, you know, for survivors who have to leave their unsafe dwelling, they may not have all of those documents right away. So we've expanded the law to include emergency protective orders, certification from an advocate, a mental health or medical professional. And so, you know, if we were just to tell folks, so let's say if you, I'm going to take myself out of it. If you were to educate your community and say, hey, Senate Bill 234 does this, and explain what it does, that is not, that's not lobbying. That's, you're just educating folks on it. And so when I go to the Capitol, I have a tendency when I'm sitting down with a partner from an organization, usually the partner from the nonprofit will state we are aware that there is Senate Bill 234. And here are the issues that we see within our agency. And it makes it extremely helpful if survivors are able to break their leases sooner, right? So be able to do all of that. They're not making an ask. What they're doing is raising awareness around a particular bill, and then they are talking about what is the current environment. I, on the other hand, I'm a registered lobbyist. I'm able to go in there and tell them and ask, not tell, but ask, it would be great, Representative so-and-so, that you help us pass this bill, right? So I'm making the ask at that point. So that's where that makes, there's that difference and nuances in what is advocacy and what is lobbying. So if you're calling a representative and asking them to vote for a bill, that's direct lobbying there. All right, next slide, please. So if your organization decides to do that, you know, there are some rules around this. Primarily, we look at what's the time and resources you put into making those asks. So you know, the IRS does not prohibit lobbying by nonprofits, but it does limit the amount of lobbying that you can do. And it's roughly around 10%, and it also depends on which level that you're doing it, whether if you're doing it state, federal, or if you're doing it within the city and the county level. And so there's some guidelines there, so you have to be careful about your time. If you are allocating more than 10% of your time doing lobbying, which is making those direct asks. Now, again, I'm just going to remind you, it's not educating folks, it's making direct asks, which many of you are not, then you're fine. Well, if you go above 10%, then you have to register yourself and report. If you are not, then you're fine. So it's not only just resources, but time. So if you pay somebody, that's funds that are being allocated to lobbying. Next slide, please. Most of us come from nonprofits. Most of us come from agencies with grant funds. And so if you are going to the Capitol and talking about making asks, very specific asks, then you cannot use your grant funds to pay for that activity. Can't do that. However, if you are going to the Capitol to educate a legislator on an issue, and you have grant funds that will cover education, then or then by all means, you're good to go. So sometimes it's a gray area, but that's how you can help distinguish, is this community education? Am I making an ask? So there's a few questions that you need to ask yourself on whether or not you would be able to utilize those grant funds. And of course, if you get in a situation where you're not quite sure, you can always give us a call and we can look at the specific situation or scenario and give you our best advice on it. There's also the Texas CBAR, which is a great resource for nonprofits across the state of Texas. And they can also provide some really clear guidance on whether or not you can first, what you're doing, is it lobbying? And secondly, are you utilizing grant funds? Now, many organizations don't even want to have that conversation when it comes to the gray area, and they will just pay for that time out of unrestricted funding. At that point, you're free and clear. You can do whatever you want if it's unrestricted funding. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so building on what we have discussed so far, I'm going to proceed and talk about the legislative process in Texas. And so there's a few fundamentals here. Thank you. Just to give you a quick overview, Texas, we're a bicameral system. So that basically means we have a Senate and we have a House. And when you pass a law, you've got to pass it both in the House and the Senate before it moves to the governor's office. According to the Texas Constitution, our legislative session is in Austin every 2 years, which is quite lovely. When you work at the Capitol, that means you're not, schlepping down the Capitol all the time, even though there is significant work during the interim. There's some benefits to that because, you have a good 18 months to plan what you'd like to push when session is active. You have the ability to build coalitions, and then at the same time, you basically just have time to think, right? And test, if you were to create a policy, how would it impact broader communities? So those are the pros. The negatives of it is you've only got 6 months to pass a law, which is it's a sprint. It's definitely a sprint. And right before session starts, there's a lovely thing called the election. So you can start building and coalitions and talk to legislators. But then once there's an election, half of those legislators you're talking to may not even be there when session starts. So that's a little bit of a drawback. It also does not allow for enough time for hearings to take place. And really it is, it's a time game. It really is a time game. You can introduce a bill, but you've got to move it through all the hearings, making sure it goes to, the first reading on the floor, then the second reading and the third reading, and then it moves over to the other, if you started in the House, and you've got to make sure it moves to the Senate. And so there's some drawbacks there. And as I mentioned earlier, by statute, the session normally it's 6 months. It starts on the second Tuesday in January of every odd numbered year, and it's limited to 140 days unless the governor calls for a special session. So if you are interested in the legislative process or just timing in general, there's a link there below that when this PowerPoint gets sent out, you can click on it and be able to get a little bit more deeper information. Moving to the next slide, how a bill works. As I mentioned, you have to, in order for a bill to pass, you have to pass it through the House and the Senate. It doesn't matter where you start. You can have a Senate bill start off first. So you can, I can go to a senator. I'm here in Austin, and so the senator who represents me is Senator Watson. As an individual at TCFV, we have the flexibility to go to any senator or any House representative and ask him to pick up our bill because we're a statewide organization. But as an individual, I can go to Senator Watson and ask him to file a bill on an issue that I care about. So you can start in the Senate, or you can start on the House side. So wherever it is you start, it all goes through the same process. There is a little bit of a change, there's little changes here and there, and it's really how they call perhaps a calendar that a bill needs to be on. So on the Senate, you have an intent calendar, where on the House, you've got a calendars committee. When we're talking about budgets on the Senate, you have a finance committee. On the House side, you have an appropriations committee, but basically it's the same. And so when we are advocating on behalf of survivors and we introduce a bill, one of the tactics we use is to introduce the same bill on both sides of the Capitol. And the reason why is it gives you a better chance, right? It's basically putting in 2 coins for one game, and hopefully one of them will pop out and become a law. And so we've got a good example of this is the Senate Bill 234 on lease termination. We introduced one on the Senate side. It was Senate Bill 234. On the other side, it was House Bill 1529. And we just basically pushed that same bill with a different title name on both ends and see which one popped out to the other side first. And so that's just a tactic that is utilized. But pretty much what you see on this slide is how the legislative process works when when there's a concept or an idea of a bill and how it gets to the governor's desk. Next slide, please. So who are your, before you start the legislative process, one of the good things to know is who are your representatives. As I mentioned, there's 2 chambers. There's 31 members on the Senate and 150 members on the House, which means there's 181 people that you have to influence. The good thing about this is that to do this, that's why they have committees. So it's a lot easier to convince 12 people on a committee. So if we're looking at, let's see here, there's a strangulation bill, Senate Bill 971. On the Senate side, there's a criminal justice committee. So that bill, because it's related to criminal justice issues, it goes over to criminal justice committee. And then all you have to do is convince 12 people on that committee. Sometimes it ranges between 10 to 14, depending on the speaker's preferences. And so that's a good thing, because you only got 12 to 14 folks to convince. Once, if it doesn't pass a committee, then it doesn't move on to the full House. So we spend a lot of time focusing on committee members. Once we get a bill out of a committee, then we start looking at influencing the entire House. And that's where we work with our local programs to call their members to push a particular bill. So that's 181 people, 181 people that you've got to convince. And then, of course, state senators and representatives there. They serve 4- and 2-year terms respectively. If you don't know who represents you, you can go to the link that I've listed there. Just type in your zip code, address, and zip code, and it will tell you who represents you within your local state district, to the state Senate, all the way up to who represents you with congressional members and also U.S. senators. Okay, Next slide, please. All right, so I've basically have given you a really broad overview of advocacy, what's the difference between an advocate and a lobbyist, a little bit of fundamentals around the legislative process. So you've got a few tools there. Now let's talk about how do you take all of that and bring it to the local level. How do you start being that individual and then moving it to a change with much broader impact that affects millions of people? So the first thing is do your homework. And you know this information. You understand the barriers and the challenges, and you also understand the solutions that can assist or make things safer for a survivor. So in order to start this process, then just gathering your survivor and service stories. There was a time, I'm just going to give a quick example. There was a time where when I was with the service agency, where we were seeing issues where our survivors were not provided interpreter services in court, right? And so our advocates had story upon stories about that particular problem. And you can't just can't just go into an office and sit down with a judge and say, you've got a problem by not providing equal access to justice, and we want you to fix it. To move someone, you've got to bring some stories in regards to how it impacts an individual. And then you can provide some information around trends. So first of all, gather your survivor and service stories. Identify what are the problems that you're seeing on the ground. Is there a lack of resources? Are there process problems such as perhaps protective orders are not being appropriately uploaded into a criminal database, or there's some safety issues, or there's just no clear protocols in place? Look at process problems. I always look at the lack of access to existing services, or perhaps there's a lack of knowledge or training. So just look at what are the problems you're seeing on the ground, and then try to create, find those stories that will demonstrate the problem and clearly show a trend. Always talk about impact. What is the impact, not only on the survivor, but the impact of the community overall? That this issue is not isolated, that the issue would, if not resolved, would result in our community being less safe, right? The other piece of it is talk to your neighbors and talk to your allied partners and seeing if they're seeing the same issues, because that's going to help you mobilize around this particular problem. And it also helps you build allies as well. And once you've done all of that, then you develop a message around the problem. When we're talking about legislative advocacy, it's not only the identification of the problem, but it's also how do we identify solutions as well. So you got to create an opportunity for yourself to come up with a solution. So those are kind of the basic starting points. Next slide, please. Earlier I talked about allies, and to do this work, it really is, even though it starts with an individual or a small group, to really move something, you just need to build your tribe a little more. And so just adding more allies to the issue. So look at partners in the work. Look at people in the community who may not be professionals within the movement, but they care about survivors. other service providers. You know, domestic violence is a very much so intersectional issue. So look beyond the domestic violence professionals. There could be other service providers like housing advocates, or there could be folks who work around issues around mental health, whatever it is, right? So connect with them, connect with associations and coalitions on other intersectional issues. A prime example of this is that there was a pause, there's a Pause Act where national partners and state partners had to work with the Humane Society. So we had to work with an association or a coalition to try to build resources for shelters so that when survivors come to seek services, they can bring their pets with them. And then, of course, you want to build allies with legislators too. There are champions in this work. So for instance, Senator Nelson from the Texas legislature, she is a champion when it comes to domestic violence funding. And so we rely on her connections and her network to move legislation for us when it comes to securing resources for programs. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so you've done your homework and you've kind of created your group of allies. Then there's a couple of tactics that I always like to share with folks. One, here's some general rules. Use plain language. We have a tendency in any field, really, it's not just a domestic violence field, but we have a tendency to speak in we have our own vocabulary, our own code, our own acronyms that we love to live in, right? We like to say HHSC, you know, provide TA. And in order to build awareness around the issue, you've got to use plain language. So consider your audiences, you know, you might have to tailor it to them, but overall, if you're trying to build a community, a wide community of folks who care, and that wide community, all those individuals may not come from your world. Give personal examples. As I mentioned earlier about collecting your stories. As you're collecting your stories, make sure you give really good examples on how things impact real people. You know, in this fast world of social media and also in our general busyness, there's not a lot of time to read and process issues. And so sometimes we just have to like distill all of those ideas and issues and create either graphics or photos that will relay the concept quickly. So use photos and graphics whenever possible. When I'm down at the Capitol, I usually have a flyer and I'm talking about something extremely complicated like funding. We need to secure funding for all of these programs and we've got turnaway rates and all of this stuff, but everything is distilled down to a one-page flyer. You should be able to quickly describe the issue and the problem or the burden and concisely, because you don't have a lot of time. You know, folks, when it comes to decision making, you probably have the decision making process takes less than 10 minutes. Somebody is on the issue right away or they're not. And so, so you should be able to make sure that you're able to talk about these issues very quickly. And just don't relay a problem, but offer solutions that work. So a lot of this, of course, ties back to your original homework that I had talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So ways to advocate, oh, I'm sorry, one slide back, testify at hearings. You move, no. Okay, well, just keep just keep it there. Let's keep it there. So on writing, I'll talk about hearings first, even though it's not on there. There's many times at TCFV, as I'd mentioned, we rely on service providers to speak to the issue. And we always ask for folks to testify at hearings. So when bills are being considered within committee, again, it's those personal stories that move things. So it's always good to participate in either oral or written testimony. A lot of it is dependent on the committee's request, but I encourage advocates to go in and do oral testimony, because legislators can see you. They can see the level of care that you have or the urgency of the issue much better in person than in writing. And I also encourage folks, if you are going in to testify in person, then also bring written testimony that you can leave for folks to read afterwards. So this could be a white paper, but again, you know, the testimony needs to be a little bit more concise and a full, actually more than a report, but leaving something written so that if they can't remember a particular fact or figure, they can go back and take a look. And it really is an opportunity, again, to highlight your expertise and experience. Okay, so moving on to the slide that is in front of you. I'm sorry, go back to the writing. Thank you. Other ways you can do this, if there's a bill that you care about, you'd be surprised, you know, in the world of emails and social media and all that good stuff, I've just seen letters be very impactful for a lot of legislators. So it's a very effective way, much more so than an email. So handwritten or mailed letters are effective, and yes, fax machines still exist. And when you put these requests in writing, you always want to make sure that the legislator has your information so that he or she can appropriately respond. Personalize your message, make sure that you share your personal experience, because it's going to make it a lot more powerful. And then, as I mentioned earlier, always provide a solution, right? So sometimes a solution could be an existing bill. And if that's the case, then give the names of pending legislation or specific bill numbers. 1 page is ideal because you need it to be concise. Folks just don't have a lot of time. And use that time to be informative. They would want, let's say if a legislator decides that topic A is very important to them, well, they're all going to need more details. They want to know where to get information. So be prepared to provide accurate information for them. When you submit any type of ask via writing, I always encourage folks to call your legislator's office, and 1, to make sure that they got the letter, or 2, you can speak to them and see if you can get an answer from them, either a yes or a no, or perhaps they can give you a reason why they might not, you know, they might shelve the idea for this session. But it's always good to do a phone follow-up. Next slide, please. So another way is to visit your legislators. So you can testify at hearings, you can write a letter, or you can advocate in person. Visiting a legislator, most of the time you'll be visiting with their staff, but don't take that as a negative, because it's usually a staff member who knows about the issue much more than the legislator, and they also provide recommendations to the legislator on how to vote or how to proceed on an issue. So I always like to talk to the legislative director or the chief of staff when I'm visiting offices, because most of the time, if I'm sitting in front of a legislator, he's already talking to a bunch of other lobbyists. He's probably talking to folks who have campaign contributions, which is a little bit difficult to compete with. He's meeting so many people, and he doesn't have time to really understand the issue. So don't be disappointed if you're not meeting with the legislator in person when you make a request. These visits are short. Most of the time it's 15 to 30 minutes. For me, in my past visits, it's always between 15 and 30 minutes. There have been times where I would have to grab either a legislator or a staff member, in the hallway to talk about an issue because we only have, 5 minutes to chat. But always assume that you have roughly around 15 to 30 minutes. So since that time is pretty short, then plan to discuss only 1 or 2 issues. There's always opportunity for follow-up meetings. So don't be disappointed if your meeting is short and it may not be with the specific representative. Next slide, please. Oh, there's my hearing slide. All right, we talked about that. Let's go ahead and move to the next one. Okay, so those are some areas. I've already discussed a few ways to advocate. One other tactic that I think is extremely useful is creating a public campaign. Using social media such as Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram is extremely powerful. Post your visit. If you visited with the legislator, post your visit on social media. It shares, you're able to share that perhaps the legislator cares about the topic matter. It just lends a lot of credibility to your issue. And keep your posts pretty much positive and neutral. There are times where you can go into a legislative office and leave pretty deflated because they don't understand domestic violence, or they say something pretty demeaning or derogatory against women or whatever that is. And it's hard. But in order to move things, you've got to make sure that your posts, when you're looking at creating a public campaign around an issue, needs to be positive or neutral. Again, I really, if I can go to the next slide, I show an example of this. So at TCFE, for us, what we do when we're trying to advocate for funding is we create a public campaign. So this was our public campaign this past year to secure $59.8 million in core services. So we wanted to get folks to really understand the issue, which is in the last 5 years, 670 women in Texas were killed. We had over 71,000 Texans receive services from Health and Human Services commissioned programs. We had folks who were turned away from service providers because there's just not enough room at the shelter. And we asked community members to fill out this postcard and send it in to us. From there, we collected a lot of these postcards, and then we brought it to the legislator. So let's say if I'm in Senator Watson's district and I submitted a postcard, then that postcard went to Senator Watson. So he knows that there is a constituent in his district that cares about this issue. This has been extremely successful for TCFE in prior years, and we continue to use this campaign, one, because it raises the awareness around family violence, and secondly, it helps us get to our goal when it comes to funding. So this is a perfect example of how you would create a public campaign. Okay, all right, next slide. Oh. Is there a way to go to the next slide? All right. It looks like there's a little bit of technical issues. The next few things I'm going to share, and it will be pretty short, is, oh, there we go. Let's see here. We're just going to talk about.
Sorry, Linda. We are experiencing technical difficulties. Hold on.
No problem. All right, thank you. So I've given you a pretty lengthy overview of legislative advocacy and how to create policies and changes. And so utilizing all those same principles, we look at how do we promote funding and how do we push forward statewide impact issues. If you can go to the next slide. In order for us to do this, we create a public policy committee. This in 2018, these are 2018 dates actually, we convened the committee 3 times and we talked about the issues. Everybody on the committee, it's a committee of approximately 34 members who from different disciplines come together and look at barriers and challenges for survivors. They bring the issues, we try to understand it. They also bring the stories that are needed. And then we look at trends. Now, when it comes to policies for survivors, there are so many things we can work on. So because we have limited staff, we can only take on a few of the important issues aside from funding. So we rank the issues and then we make a recommendation to the board for a final vote on our legislative agenda. From there, TCFE, from one session to the next, we usually carry around 3 to 4 items each session. Next slide, please. So from that process and basically from all of the principles that we talked about, this session we advocated for $59.8 million for core services. This is to, of course, provide safe shelter and advocacy and hotline services. This is to keep your doors open and the lights on. What we have heard from the ground is that we have a capacity issue. There are not enough beds for survivors. So one of the ways to address this issue is if we were to couple long-term services, and when I say long-term services, I'm talking about services that have long-term impact, such as economic stability services, housing, being able to provide a survivor's rent for a couple of months, or to provide transitional housing, legal services, and of course, mental health counseling. Those services coupled with the emergency shelter services would reduce the likelihood of survivors going back to an abusive home. It also reduces the likelihood of them getting abused again, and in turn reduces the likelihood of them having to get in line to gain shelter services. And so we have advocated for $5.5 million. I'm happy to say that that was achieved this session. Also, $3.5 million for batterer intervention programs to ensure offender accountability. This is pretty much level funding. And then also $600,000 for domestic violence high-risk teams. Again, tied to offender accountability and survivor safety. Next slide, please. the laws that were passed because of it's not just our advocacy, but really that the advocacy from all of our allies and the coalitions that were built. Senate Bill 971 was on our legislative priority list. Now a law has been passed that all law enforcement needs to receive training for strangulation. We know that strangulation is a high lethality risk factor, and our first responders need the ability to determine or perhaps ask the appropriate questions to collect necessary evidence for the prosecution of a case, because strangulation is a felony, in addition to being a high risk factor. And also our survivors need to access immediate medical care. So if a first responder is not aware that a survivor is a strangulation victim, then that could create some health impacts down the road. So Senate Bill 971 was passed. Earlier I talked about Senate Bill 234, lease termination expansion. That one passed as well. We did have sometimes we can't get all of our legislative priorities met. But we had two bills. One got vetoed, sad to say, Senate Bill 1804, which would have required conditions of bond to be entered into the Texas Criminal Information Database. And this bill would not only change how DPS creates its fields within the database, but it requires consistent and timely conditions of bond to be entered. And the reason why this bill even came into existence is because we had heard from prosecutors, from family violence advocates, survivors themselves, that many times law enforcement are not able to arrest someone who has a violation of a condition of bond. And so it puts survivors at risk, and moreover, it also puts law enforcement at risk because they are not aware of all of the risk factors that have been considered for this condition of bond to even be ordered by a judge. So this bill passed both the House and the Senate. Unfortunately, at the very last at the last hour, 11th hour of the session, the House sponsor put in a non-germane amendment that we didn't agree with, and it passed. With this, it was a hazardous waste amendment. It got stuck on there, went to the governor's office, and the governor vetoed it. So now we've got to start over, and hopefully we don't have sponsors putting on non-germane amendments. And then the last bill that stalled out, this was a gun bill on surrender protocols. So, and that's a whole other session in itself about guns in Texas. So those are the laws that was part of our policy initiative. There are many, there was a little bit over 80 laws that we monitored over the session. And we utilize all those same basic principles of building allyship, getting our stories together, providing solutions to either combat bills that just were not helpful for survivors, or help promote bills that were. Next slide, please. And now that you've got a good overview on legislative advocacy, go forth and make change. So share your expertise, share your stories or survivor stories. I hope to see you testify at hearings. You definitely are the best speakers when it comes to the need for funding, services and policies. And then also you've got all the tools to help build allies. So I know that an hour and a half of legislative advocacy is not the, it's not fully comprehensive and holistic, but I'm always here to answer questions and support you in your efforts. And on the next slide, you have my contact information, my phone number, and my email. And I know that there hasn't been a lot of time for Q&A, but I'm happy to stay on to answer any, or I leave it up to Brooke and to Megan to decide. But thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for participating on this webinar.
Thank you so much, Linda. What a great overview of all of the various ways that we can be using our voices to advocate for victims. If anybody does have any questions, I will go ahead and leave the Q&A box and the chat box open, but we'll officially end the webinar. I'll just leave it running for a few minutes. Again, thank you so much, Linda. Everyone, please look for evaluations and your accreditation certificates in your email on Monday. And if you don't have any questions for Linda, then have a great weekend.